Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and in today's video we are going to have a look at something that many of you are going to encounter in your pre-flight calculations. So we're sitting here in Bilbao on the apron, we are doing our preliminary cockpit preparation and doing our initial performance calculation. Now, you synchronize the load sheet, you synchronize the weather, you hit calculate, and it gives you a flap 3 takeoff for apparently no reason at all. Now, in this video we're going to talk about takeoff flap setting on the A320 family aircraft and about the different options that you've got available. First of all, why does the Phoenix EFB default to giving you a flap 3 takeoff in many different situations when you go for flap config optimum? Well, I can only guess, but my assumption over here is that it goes for a balanced field takeoff and tries to minimize the runway usage. Obviously, highest flap setting is going to give you the earliest liftoff point, and for that reason it goes for config 3. Just an assumption. If it works different internally, then, and you know about how the Phoenix especially works internally, be sure to leave it in the comments below. Now, a config 3 takeoff is not very efficient in terms of fuel usage. You can imagine when looking at the aft part of the wing at the trailing edge and you've got the flaps down all that much for config 3, the plane has more lift, but it also has a lot more drag. When we look into the Airbus AVCOM, into the green operating procedures, then it does give you an advice there, first of all emphasizing that the safest possible option should be selected for your takeoff. But the next sentence behind that is that you are recommended to use the lowest safe flap setting for your takeoff in order to save on fuel. Now, there are two possible configurations that A320 operators typically choose. Some go for a config 1+F takeoff by default, others go for a config 2 takeoff by default. Now, let's quickly run those calculations and see what we're going to get. So using config 2 over here, takeoff speeds 33, 35, 36, 58 degrees flex temperature, and if we go for a config 1+F takeoff, you can see slightly higher speeds, same flex temperature. Now, let's talk about why there is a difference in the default configurations that airlines use, which are either 1+F or config 2. Now, the difference is the very aft part of the airplane over here. If you choose a config 1+F takeoff, you've got a little bit less tail clearance than if you go for a config 2 takeoff. Now, that means config 2 does provide a little bit better tail clearance, you will lift off earlier, therefore the tailplane is not going to come as close to the runway than if you use config 1+F. However, the sacrifice is still that config 2 is going to use more fuel than config 1+F. But how much of a fuel difference are we actually talking about here when comparing those flap settings? Well, there is a little guide from Airbus that is available to airlines. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any public version of it, so let me just talk about it instead of showing you. But typically, on a normal takeoff, the difference between a config 3 and a config 1+F takeoff is approximately 25 to 40 kilograms of fuel usage. Doesn't sound like a lot, but now imagine the entire fleet worldwide, 9,000 A320 aircraft, and those are all using those 25 kilograms extra. It doesn't take an expert in mathematics to determine that we're talking huge amounts of fuel on a worldwide scale, even though on the particular operation it doesn't seem all that much if you just look at your own isolated flight. Now, how should you decide then which config to go for? Well, the biggest difference that I noticed is that many legacy carriers seem to prefer a config 2 takeoff, while many newer carriers, and especially low-cost carriers, do prefer a config 1+F takeoff. Both are likewise safe, provided that no factors like the climb performance requirements, etc. are limiting. You just need to be a little bit more careful doing a config 1+F takeoff in order not to tail strike. However, both are safe. Now, what does that mean for your simulator flying then? What should you use? Well, my personal recommendation here is to go all by the Airbus green procedures and just do config 1+F, unless your performance limits do not allow to do so. Now, if you prefer to fly for legacy carriers, think Lufthansa, Swiss, British Airways, then config 2 might be a default flap setting that you may want to use. Now, if you now say, but hey Emmanuel, I always see you doing config 2 takeoffs in your live streams, but over here you're saying use config 1 plus F. Why is that? Well, quite a simple explanation. On the A320 fleet, my airline defaults to config 1 plus F takeoffs, and that is what Airbus recommends as well. But on the A330 fleet, we are doing config 2 takeoffs by default. The reason for that is using config 2, you've got approximately 1 meter of tail margin when you lift off, so 1 meter of tail clearance, and using config 1 plus F on the A330 you've got only half a meter. So it is a rather significant difference on the A330, and we prefer to go for the config 2 default option as it provides a little bit more tail clearance. Now on the A330 we're looking at a difference in approximately 40 kilograms of fuel usage here between config 2 and config 1 plus F, but that is roughly the margin that we do have, so the company just prefers to go the safer option there and use config 2 for the takeoffs on the A330. Now, what is worth calculating though, if you are running your takeoff performance, is to have a look at the flex takeoff temperature. So right now we're getting 58 degrees for both config 1 plus F and a config 2 takeoff. So in that case it doesn't make all that much of a difference for engine life. But if you're able to choose either 1 plus F or config 2, and one of them gives you a greater flex temperature, so a higher temperature, then that might be the preferable option, since the cost of maintenance for bringing the engine to a higher temperature by using less flex usually outweighs the cost for the additional fuel burn by using a lower flap setting. So it is certainly worth running that configuration. Now, what is interesting to note there, on the real-world Airbus performance tool, you typically have two options. You either have the Optimum option, which is usually going to give you config 1 plus F, and then you have a default option selected by the airline. So if I go into my performance tool on the A330, then it will by default select config 2 and tell me in brackets STD standard behind that. And if I want to go to Optimum config, I have to make that conscious decision to change the default flap setting. Now, that much about standard flap settings for takeoff. In order to recap, most operators are going to default to config 1 plus F takeoff. Mostly legacy operators default to config 2 takeoff on the A320 family fleets. In any case, config 3 is really only used when it is necessary for performance requirements, which is usually on short runways that don't have many obstacles behind them, so that you're not climb limited. Always keep in mind, the flap setting you choose is not only relevant for your normal takeoff, in which case there is ample power available on those modern 2-engine aircraft, but remember, you also have to fly that single-engine takeoff with it, so the higher the flap setting, the worse your initial climb performance is going to be. Alright, that is going to do it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something on this one. If you're also an Airbus pilot and your airline is following different philosophies, be sure to put it in the comments below, as I'm really looking forward to seeing other sides of the story as well. With that, I would like to say thank you very much for watching. Hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and a comment below to let me know what you think about it, and be sure to subscribe if you're up for more. I would like to thank you very much for watching, and if you really love what I'm doing, would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and see you all again on the next one.